Have you ever noticed how some people can walk into a room and completely change the energy? I'm talking about that kind of presence that makes everyone else suddenly aware of their posture, their voice, their very existence. If you live anywhere with a strong Italian community, you probably know exactly what I mean. There's something about real authority that doesn't need to announce itself. Sofia Chin had been working at Bellinate for 8 months, and in that time she'd learned to read the subtle shifts in atmosphere that accompanied different types of customers. The nervous first-date couples who spoke in hushed tones and barely touched their food. The business dinners where men in expensive suits discussed deals over wine that cost more than she made in a week. The family celebrations that filled the dining room with laughter and animated conversations in rapid Italian. But tonight felt different from the moment she walked through the employee entrance at 4:30. The October air in Boston carried that sharp bite that promised winter wasn't far away, and she'd pulled her cardigan tighter as she hurried down the narrow alley behind the restaurant. Her reflection in the dark window showed a young woman who'd learned to keep her head down and her movements efficient. At 26, Sofia had the kind of understated prettiness that came from good bone structure and careful grooming rather than obvious glamour. Her black hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, her makeup minimal but polished, her server's uniform pressed and spotless. 3 months. It had been exactly 3 months since she'd packed everything she owned into 2 suitcases and left San Diego with nothing but her savings account and a desperate plan to disappear. 3 months since she'd last felt Marcus's hands on her, since she'd last flinched at the sound of footsteps behind her, since she'd last checked her phone with the familiar mixture of hope and dread. The therapy books said healing wasn't linear. Some days she felt strong, capable, proud of the life she was building. Other days the weight of constantly looking over her shoulder exhausted her so completely that she could barely manage to smile at customers. Tonight was somewhere in between, that careful neutral state where she could function but couldn't quite relax. Bellinate was exactly the kind of place she'd never imagined working before. The dining room was all warm lighting and exposed brick, with fresh flowers on every table and the kind of authentic Italian cuisine that drew food critics from New York. The staff was small but professional, mostly servers who'd been there for years and knew how to handle the wealthy clientele without being either servile or familiar. Sofia had gotten the job through a combination of desperation and luck. She'd been staying in a women's shelter while she looked for work, and one of the counselors had a cousin who managed the front of house. The pay was good, the tips were excellent, and most importantly, it was the kind of upscale establishment where customers minded their own business and staff turnover was low enough that she could blend in without attracting attention. She'd been saving every penny she could, building toward the security deposit on a real apartment instead of the furnished studio she'd been renting week to week. The math was simple if brutal. If she could work 6 shifts a week for another 2 months, she'd have enough saved to sign a lease somewhere safe. Somewhere with a doorman and security cameras and neighbors who weren't transient enough to ignore screaming. The dinner rush started early on Friday nights. By 6, every table was full, and there was a waiting list that stretched past 8 o'clock. Sofia moved through her section with practiced efficiency, taking orders and delivering plates with the kind of seamless service that kept customers happy and tips generous. Her tables included a young couple celebrating an engagement, an elderly Italian man who came in every Friday and always ordered the same thing, and a table of businessmen discussing what sounded like construction contracts. She was refilling water glasses when she first noticed him. He sat alone at table 12, the corner booth that offered a clear view of the entire dining room. Most people who dined alone at Bellinate were either regulars who came for the food or business travelers who needed a quiet place to make calls. This man was neither. He had the kind of presence that made her aware of him without looking directly, the way you might notice a predator at the edge of your vision. When she finally glanced over, she found herself cataloging details with the automatic caution that had become second nature. Probably in his early 30s, tall even sitting down, with dark hair styled in a way that suggested expensive barbers. His suit was definitely custom, the kind of tailoring that cost more than most people's rent. But it was his hands that caught her attention, strong and scarred in a way that didn't match his polished appearance. He wasn't her table, but she found herself aware of his presence throughout the evening. He ate slowly, checking his phone occasionally, and seemed to be observing the room with the same careful attention she'd learned to use herself. When other staff members approached his table, their demeanor shifted slightly. More deferential, more careful. It was just past 8 when her carefully constructed world collapsed. Sophia was carrying a tray of entrees to table 6 when she saw the familiar profile near the host's stand. For a moment, her brain refused to process what her eyes were showing her. It couldn't be Marcus. It couldn't be. She'd been so careful, so thorough in her escape. She'd used cash for everything, hadn't contacted anyone from her old life, had chosen Boston specifically because it was 3,000 miles away from everything familiar. But there he was, talking to the hostess with that same charming smile that had fooled everyone when they'd first started dating. The same smile he'd used to apologize after the first time he'd grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises. The same smile he'd used to convince her friends that she was overreacting, being dramatic, making things up. The tray in her hands started to shake. The carefully balanced plates began to rattle against the porcelain, the sound seeming impossibly loud in her ears. She watched as if from outside her body as Marcus turned toward the dining room, scanning the tables with the methodical thoroughness of someone looking for something specific. Looking for her. His eyes found her across the crowded room, and his smile widened. Not the charming smile he used on other people, but the one she remembered from her nightmares. The one that said he'd found something that belonged to him, and he intended to reclaim it. Time seemed to slow as he started walking toward her. The dining room noise faded to a distant buzz. Her lungs felt like they were filled with concrete. The rational part of her mind was screaming instructions. Move, run, call for help, do something. But her body had frozen completely, trapped in the same paralysis that had made her so easy to control for so long. She was dimly aware that other diners were starting to notice. Conversations were trailing off at nearby tables. The elderly Italian man was frowning in her direction. One of the other servers was approaching, probably wondering why she was standing motionless in the middle of the dining room, holding a tray of cooling food. Marcus was halfway across the room when a voice spoke from somewhere behind her. "Wait outside. I'll take care of this." The voice was quiet, barely above conversational volume, but something in the tone made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even really a command. It was a statement of fact delivered with the kind of calm certainty that suggested the speaker had never encountered a situation they couldn't handle. Sophia turned to find the man from table 12 standing beside her. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd realized. Tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, with a kind of build that suggested he could be gentle or dangerous, depending on the situation. His face was all sharp angles and controlled expression, but his eyes were surprisingly warm as they met hers. "Don't worry," he said, and somehow she believed him. Marcus had stopped walking, his expression shifting from predatory confidence to something more uncertain. The charming smile was still in place, but Sophia could see the calculation happening behind his eyes as he took in this unexpected obstacle. "I'm sorry, who are you?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying that familiar edge of barely controlled irritation that used to make her stomach clench with anxiety. "I'm here to speak with my girlfriend." The man beside her didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't make any threatening gestures. But something changed in the air around them. Sophia felt it like a drop in barometric pressure, that sense of impending storm that made animals seek shelter. "She's not your girlfriend," the man said, "and you're disturbing my dinner." It took a moment for Sophia to realize that conversations throughout the dining room had gone quiet. Not completely silent, but muted in the way that happened when people sensed danger and wanted to be able to hear what might happen next. Even the kitchen noise seemed subdued. Marcus tried to maintain his smile, but she could see the first flicker of real uncertainty. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but this is between me and Sophia. We just need to work some things out." The man's expression didn't change, but when he spoke again, his voice carried an undertone that made Sophia's pulse skip. "No, you need to leave. Now." Something in those simple words seemed to finally penetrate Marcus's bravado. His gaze shifted from the man to Sophia and back again, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw actual fear in his eyes. Not the momentary uncertainty of someone facing an unexpected obstacle, but the deep recognition of something genuinely dangerous. "Fine," Marcus said, taking a step back. But this isn't over, Sophia. You know that, right? You can't just disappear and think that fixes everything. The man moved then, not dramatically, but with the kind of fluid precision that suggested he was very comfortable with his own physical capabilities. He placed himself between Marcus and Sophia, not quite blocking her, but making it clear that any approach would have to go through him. Yes, the man said quietly. It is over. Marcus stared at him for a long moment. Some kind of wordless communication happening that Sophia couldn't interpret. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, his movements sharp with suppressed anger, but without the confidence he'd shown when he'd first entered. The dining room seemed to exhale collectively as the door closed behind him. Conversations gradually resumed, though she caught several glances in their direction. The elderly Italian man gave her a small nod that somehow conveyed both sympathy and approval. Sophia realized she was still holding the tray of food, her knuckles white from gripping the handles. The plates had gone cold, but she couldn't seem to make her hands release them. Here, the man said gently, taking the tray from her trembling fingers. Let me help you with that. His hands were warm and steady as they brushed against hers, and something about the simple kindness of the gesture broke through her shock. She found herself looking up into dark eyes that held genuine concern rather than the calculating assessment she'd learned to fear from men. Thank you, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how he found me here. My name is Vincenzo, he said. Vincenzo Romano. And you don't need to worry about him anymore. The rest of Sophia's shift passed in a strange haze of hypervigilance and confusion. Every time the front door opened, her heart jumped, expecting to see Marcus pushing his way back inside. But he didn't return, and somehow, she knew he wouldn't as long as Vincenzo Romano remained at table 12, which he did, for the entire evening. She tried to focus on her remaining tables, apologizing to the couple whose entrees had gone cold while she'd been frozen in terror. They were understanding, especially after the manager, Tony, quietly comped their meal and assured them that the situation had been handled. Tony himself kept shooting glances between her and Vincenzo, his expression troubled but careful. It wasn't until she was clearing the last of the dessert plates that Tony approached her during a brief lull. Sophia, he said quietly, pulling her aside near the server station. Take the rest of the week off. With pay. She stared at him. Tony was a good manager, fair and professional, but Bellinate wasn't the kind of place that gave servers paid time off without a very good reason. I don't understand. Did I do something wrong? I know I was distracted tonight, but no, nothing like that. His voice was careful, the way people spoke when they were choosing their words deliberately. Mr. Romano suggested it would be best. For your safety. Mr. Romano suggested it. The phrasing sent a chill down her spine. How well did Tony know Vincenzo? And why would a customer's suggestion carry enough weight to affect her employment? I need the money, she said honestly. I can't afford to take time off. You'll be paid, Tony repeated firmly. And when you come back, there might be some additional opportunities available. Better shifts, better sections. The implication hung in the air between them. Someone was taking care of things for her. Someone with enough influence to make a manager change a server's schedule and hint at preferential treatment. She glanced toward table 12, where Vincenzo was signing his check with the same calm precision he'd brought to everything else that evening. As if he felt her gaze, he looked up and their eyes met across the dining room. His expression was unreadable, but something in his dark eyes seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed defenses. When the restaurant closed at 11, Sophia found herself moving through the closing routine on autopilot. Rolling silverware, wiping down tables, counting her tips with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The other servers chatted among themselves, but she caught the occasional glance in her direction, the carefully neutral tone that suggested they knew more about the evening's events than they were saying. Vincenzo had settled his bill and moved to the bar, where he sat with a glass of something expensive-looking and dark. Waiting. She realized with a start that he was waiting for her. The recognition should have frightened her. After Marcus, any man showing that kind of focused attention should have sent her running. But there was something different about the quality of Vincenzo's attention. Where Marcus's focus had felt like being trapped in a spotlight, examined, and found wanting, Vincenzo's presence felt more like standing near a fireplace on a cold night. Warm, protective, dangerous only if you got too close to the flames. When she finally clocked out and gathered her purse from her locker, Vincenzo was standing near the employee exit, his expensive coat draped over one arm. The alley behind the restaurant was poorly lit, the kind of place that had made her nervous every night for the past 8 months. Tonight, with him there, it felt safer than her own apartment. "I'll drive you home," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's not necessary," she replied automatically, the polite deflection she'd perfected over months of keeping people at arm's length. "I take the tea." "Not tonight." His voice was gentle but final. "Not after what happened." She should have argued. Every instinct she developed since leaving Marcus told her not to get into a car with a man she didn't know, no matter how much he'd helped her. But those same instincts were also screaming that she wasn't safe yet, that Marcus wouldn't give up this easily, and that whatever protection Vincenzo offered was better than facing the night alone. The car was exactly what she'd expected: sleek, black, expensive enough that she hesitated before touching the leather seat. But it was also immaculately clean and smelled like good cologne and something indefinably masculine. Safe, her brain provided, though she couldn't have explained why. "Where do you live?" Vincenzo asked as he started the engine. She gave him the address of her studio apartment in Alston, watching his face for any reaction to the modest neighborhood. If he had any thoughts about her living situation, he kept them to himself. The drive passed in relative silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable quiet she'd learned to dread with Marcus. This felt more like peaceful coexistence, two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. The radio played softly in the background, something classical that suited the expensive interior. "How did you know?" she asked finally as they turned onto her street. "That he was dangerous, I mean." Vincenzo glanced at her, his profile sharp in the passing streetlights. "I've seen men like him before. The way they move, the way they look at what they think belongs to them." Something in his tone suggested he'd done more than just observe men like Marcus. She found herself studying his hands on the steering wheel, remembering the scars she'd noticed earlier. Strong hands that could probably be gentle or devastating depending on the circumstances. "What do you do?" The question slipped out before she could stop herself. "For work, I mean." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I handle problems," he said finally. "For my family." The phrasing was careful, deliberately vague, but something about it made her pulse quicken. She'd been in Boston long enough to understand that certain neighborhoods, certain restaurants, certain families operated by their own rules. The kind of rules that didn't always align with what was legal, but that sometimes provided a different kind of justice than what the courts offered. Her apartment building was exactly what it looked like from the outside: old, tired, but clean. The kind of place that catered to graduate students and people starting over who needed month-to-month leases and didn't ask too many questions about references. "I'll walk you up," Vincenzo said, already getting out of the car. "It's fine, really. I'm on the 2nd floor, and there's good lighting in the stairwell." But he was already moving around the car to open her door, and something about his easy authority made arguing feel pointless. She found herself accepting his offered hand as she stepped onto the sidewalk, acutely aware of the warmth and strength of his grip. The building's security was minimal at best. A front door that locked but could be easily forced, a narrow stairwell with flickering fluorescent lights, thin walls that carried every sound from neighboring apartments. Vincenzo took in these details with the same systematic attention he'd shown the restaurant, his expression growing more thoughtful with each flight of stairs. Her apartment was at the end of the hall, a corner unit that gave her 2 windows and slightly more space than the other studios. She fumbled with her keys, suddenly self-conscious about bringing someone like him to a place like this. "May I?" he asked, indicating her door. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched as he examined the lock, the door frame, the sight lines from the stairs. His assessment was quick but thorough, the kind of security evaluation that suggested he knew exactly what he was looking for. "You need better locks," he said quietly. "And something on the windows." "I know. It's just temporary, until I can afford something better." He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and she felt stripped bare under that dark gaze. Not violated the way she'd felt under Marcus's scrutiny, but seen in a way that was somehow both terrifying and comforting. "You're stronger than you know," he said, and something in his voice made her chest tighten. "Most people who've been through what you have, they don't rebuild. They don't start over in a new city, work double shifts, save every penny to create something better. How do you know what I've been through? The same way you knew to be afraid when he walked into the restaurant. Some things don't need to be explained. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, sleek black with silver lettering. His name, a phone number, nothing else. Call me if he comes back, Vincenzo said. Or if you need anything else. She took the card, their fingers brushing as he handed it over. The contact sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through her, the first time she'd felt anything like attraction since escaping Marcus. It should have frightened her, this sudden recognition of her own desire. Instead, it felt like waking up after a long illness. Why are you helping me? The question came out more vulnerable than she'd intended. Because someone should. And because I don't like men who hurt women. There was something in his voice when he said it, a cold edge that suggested his dislike for such men went well beyond passive disapproval. She found herself wondering what had happened to the last person who'd crossed that particular line with him. Thank you, she said simply. For everything. Lock the door behind me. All of them. She watched from her window as he walked back to his car, noting the way he checked the street in both directions before getting in. Professional caution, she realized. The kind of awareness that came from living in a world where threats could come from anywhere. As his taillights disappeared around the corner, Sophia found herself holding his business card and trying to process everything that had happened. 6 hours ago, her biggest worry had been saving enough money for a security deposit. Now she was under the protection of a man who could make restaurant managers change employee schedules with a suggestion and send her abusive ex running with nothing more than a quiet word. She should be terrified. Everything about Vincenzo Romano screamed danger, from his expensive clothes to his casual authority to the way other people deferred to him without question. But as she locked her door and checked the windows, she realized that for the first time in months, she felt truly safe. And that scared her more than anything. 3 days of unexpected freedom should have been a relief. Sophia woke each morning without the pressure of rushing to work, had coffee without watching the clock, took walks around her neighborhood without the bone-deep exhaustion that came from working double shifts. For the first time since arriving in Boston, she had time to simply breathe. Instead, she felt like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The rational part of her mind knew that Marcus wouldn't give up easily. He'd spent 2 years systematically breaking down her confidence, isolating her from friends and family, making her believe that she couldn't survive without him. Finding her in Boston after 3 months meant he'd been looking, planning, probably monitoring her credit cards or social media, despite her efforts to stay invisible. But it was one thing to know logically that he wouldn't disappear quietly, and another to live with the constant awareness that he was somewhere in the city, watching, waiting for his next opportunity. She'd carried Vincenzo's business card with her for 3 days, the black cardstock growing soft from handling. Twice she'd started to call him. Once when she'd seen a man with Marcus's build outside her building, and once when she'd gotten a hang-up call on her apartment phone. Both times she'd stopped herself, unsure what exactly she would say. Thank you for the other night. I'm scared and don't know who else to call. I can't stop thinking about the way you made me feel safe for the first time in years. On Thursday afternoon, she finally ventured out for groceries. Her refrigerator held little more than takeout containers and a carton of milk that was probably expired. The mundane task of shopping for food felt like a small act of rebellion against the fear that had kept her apartment bound for 3 days. The Star Market on Brighton Avenue was busy enough that she felt anonymous among the college students and young professionals picking up necessities. She moved through the aisles methodically, choosing items that would last, nothing that required her to come back soon. Rice, pasta, canned tomatoes, the basics that could stretch a tight budget. She was reaching for a box of cereal when she heard his voice behind her. I know you're ignoring my calls, Sophia. The box slipped from her numb fingers, crashing to the floor and spilling cornflakes across the linoleum. Other shoppers glanced over with mild irritation before continuing with their own errands, completely oblivious to the fact that her world had just tilted sideways. Marcus stood 3 feet away, positioned between her and the main aisle in a way that seemed casual but effectively blocked her escape route. He looked exactly the same as he had 3 months ago. Clean-cut, conventionally handsome, wearing the kind of business casual clothes that helped him blend into any professional environment. The same appearance that had fooled everyone into thinking he was a catch. You changed your number, he continued conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. That wasn't very nice. I've been worried about you. Her mouth felt like cotton, but somehow she managed to speak. How did you find me? He smiled then. The expression she'd once thought was charming and now recognized as something much colder. You're not as invisible as you think you are, baby. Credit cards leave trails. And you always did have predictable habits. I don't use credit cards anymore. The words came out defensive, which only made his smile widen. No, but your friend Jessica does. Amazing what people will tell you when they think you're planning a surprise visit. Jessica, her college roommate, one of the few people who'd known she was leaving California. Sophia felt sick imagining the conversation. Marcus's practiced charm convincing someone who'd never seen his other side to reveal information about her supposed fresh start. I told you this wasn't over, he said, taking a step closer. You think you can just run away and start some new life without me? We have too much history for that. She wanted to run, but her legs felt leaden, trapped in the same paralysis that had frozen her at the restaurant. The grocery store aisles suddenly felt impossibly narrow, the fluorescent lights too bright, the cheerful pop music playing overhead grotesquely inappropriate for the moment. You look tired, Marcus continued, his voice taking on the false concern she remembered so well. This independence thing isn't working out for you, is it? When's the last time you had a real meal? A good night's sleep? She could feel other shoppers beginning to notice the tension, could see a store employee hovering near the end cap with the nervous expression of someone who sensed trouble but didn't know how to handle it. I have to go, she managed, but when she tried to step around him, he moved to block her path. We're not done talking. That was when she remembered the business card in her jacket pocket. Her fingers were shaking so hard she could barely dial the number, but somehow she managed to press the call button and hold the phone to her ear. It rang once before Vincenzo's voice came through the speaker, calm and assured. Sophia? He's here, she whispered. At the Star Market on Brighton Avenue. I don't know what to do. Stay where you are. Don't go anywhere with him. I'll be right there. The line went dead, and she found Marcus staring at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but something much more dangerous. Calculation mixed with genuine surprise. Who was that? He asked. Someone who doesn't like men who threaten women. The phrase came out stronger than she'd expected, an echo of Vincenzo's words from 3 nights ago. For a moment Marcus looked genuinely taken aback, as if he'd expected her to crumble the way she always had before. You've got to be kidding me, he said. You're seeing someone? Already? You couldn't last 3 months without finding some guy to take care of you. It's not like that. Then what is it like, Sophia? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you replaced me pretty quickly for someone who claimed she needed space to figure herself out. She could have explained that Vincenzo wasn't her boyfriend, that their relationship was complicated and undefined, and probably dangerous for reasons she didn't fully understand. But something about Marcus's tone, the possessive anger that treated her like property he'd temporarily misplaced, made her lift her chin instead. It's like someone who actually respects me, she said. The words hung in the air between them, and she watched his expression shift from surprise to the kind of cold fury she'd learned to fear. He took another step closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, the same scent that used to comfort her and now made her stomach turn. You don't know what respect is, he said quietly. You don't know what you need, what you want, what's good for you. You never did. That's why you need me. That was when she saw them. 2 men in dark jackets who'd appeared at either end of the aisle, positioned casually, but with the kind of alert attention that suggested they were there for a specific purpose. Neither of them looked directly at Marcus, but something about their presence made the air in the grocery store feel charged with tension. Marcus noticed them too. His head turned slightly, tracking their positions, and for the first time since he'd appeared, she saw uncertainty flicker across his face. Friends of yours? He asked, but his voice had lost its confident edge. She didn't have to answer. Vincenzo appeared at the end of the aisle, moving with that same fluid grace she remembered from the restaurant. He wasn't hurrying, wasn't making any aggressive moves, but something about his approach made Marcus take an involuntary step backward. Mr. Chun, Vincenzo said politely, as if they were meeting at a business lunch rather than in a grocery store where Marcus had been cornering his ex-girlfriend. I believe we discussed this the other night. We didn't discuss anything, Marcus replied, but the bravado was forced now. And her name isn't Chin anymore. Vincenzo's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him. The same atmospheric pressure drop she'd felt at the restaurant, but more focused now, more personal. Her name, Vincenzo said quietly, is whatever she wants it to be. Just like where she lives, who she sees, and whether she wants to speak to you. She watched Marcus's face cycle through several emotions: anger, frustration, and something that might have been fear. His gaze moved from Vincenzo to the two men still positioned at the exits, and she could see him doing the math, realizing that whatever authority he'd held over her had evaporated completely. "This isn't over," Marcus said finally, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes," Vincenzo replied. "It is." There was something in his tone that made even Sophia shiver, a quiet finality that suggested the conversation was closed permanently. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. The two men in dark jackets followed at a discreet distance, and she realized they would probably continue following until Marcus left the city entirely. Vincenzo approached her slowly, his expression gentling as he took in her shaky breathing and pale complexion. Without a word, he knelt to gather the scattered cornflakes, his movements efficient and unhurried. "Are you hurt?" he asked, rising to face her. She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Now that the immediate threat was over, reaction was setting in. Her hands were trembling, her knees felt weak, and she had to fight the urge to burst into tears in the middle of the cereal aisle. "Come on," Vincenzo said gently. "Let's get you somewhere safe." This time she didn't argue when he guided her toward the exit, leaving her abandoned shopping cart behind. The mundane act of grocery shopping suddenly seemed impossibly complicated, a luxury she couldn't afford when Marcus could appear anywhere at any time. The drive to Vincenzo's penthouse passed in a blur of expensive neighborhoods and increasing elevation. By the time they reached the building in Back Bay, she was feeling slightly more human, though her hands were still shaking when she tried to buckle her seatbelt. The building was exactly what she'd expected: sleek glass and steel, with a doorman who nodded respectfully to Vincenzo and pretended not to notice her rumpled appearance. The elevator was all mirrors and polished brass, making her acutely aware of how out of place she looked in her jeans and cardigan. "I can't stay here," she said as they rose toward the top floor. "This is too much. I should just go home." "Home isn't safe anymore," Vincenzo replied matter-of-factly. "He knows where you live, where you work, probably where you shop, and what route you take to get there. Staying in your apartment would be putting yourself in danger." The elevator doors opened directly into his penthouse, and she stepped into a space that belonged in a magazine spread. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Boston Harbor, while the furniture was all clean lines and expensive materials. Everything looked like it had been chosen by someone with exquisite taste and unlimited resources. But it was the kitchen that made her feel most out of place. Professional-grade appliances, marble countertops that probably cost more than she'd made in the past year, a wine refrigerator that held bottles she could never afford to drink. This wasn't just wealth. It was a completely different universe from anything she'd ever experienced. "I know it's a lot," Vincenzo said, watching her take in the space. "But it's secure. He can't get to you here." She turned to look at him. This man who'd rescued her twice in 3 days and was now offering her refuge in his obviously expensive home. He'd shed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, making him look slightly more approachable, but no less intimidating. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You don't even know me." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much. "I know enough," he said finally. "I know you're brave enough to start over in a new city with nothing. I know you worked 2 jobs to save money for a better apartment. I know you've been hurt, but you haven't let it make you cruel. How could you possibly know all that? The same way I knew your ex was dangerous the moment I saw him. Some things don't need explanation." He moved toward the kitchen, rolling his sleeves up further, and she caught a better glimpse of the scars on his hands and forearms. Not accidental injuries, she realized, but the kind of deliberate marks that came from violence. "When's the last time you had a real meal?" he asked, echoing Marcus's words, but without the cruel undertone. "I eat," she said defensively. "Takeout and cereal don't count. Sit down, let me cook for you." She watched him move around the kitchen with surprising competence, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator with the confidence of someone who actually used the expensive appliances. Pasta, fresh herbs, what looked like homemade sauce from a container marked with careful handwriting. "This is your mother's recipe, isn't it?" she asked, noting the familiar movements as he prepared the ingredients. His hands stilled for a moment. "She passed away when I was 15. Car accident. But yes, she taught me to cook before that." Something in his voice made her chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. "I'm sorry. That must have been terrible." "It was. But it taught me that the people we care about can be taken away without warning. That's why protecting them matters." She studied his profile as he worked, the sharp angles of his face softened by the domestic setting. There was something almost incongruous about watching him perform such a normal task in his expensive suit, but his movements were sure and practiced. "What do you do?" she asked again. "Really, I mean, because I don't think handling problems for your family involves cooking dinner." He glanced at her, something unreadable flickering across his expression. "My family has business interests throughout New England. Restaurants, construction, import, and export. Sometimes those interests conflict with other people's interests." That's a very careful way of not answering my question. Some answers are dangerous to know. She could have left it there, accepted the polite deflection, and pretended she didn't understand what kind of family business required the kind of security she'd witnessed at the grocery store. But something about the way he'd protected her, the quiet authority that made other people defer to him, the scars on his hands, made her push harder. "You're talking about the Mafia, aren't you?" The word hung in the air between them, heavier than she'd expected. Vincenzo's hands stilled on the pasta he was stirring, and when he looked at her, his expression was completely serious. "Does that frighten you?" "It should," she said honestly. "Everything about this should frighten me. The fact that you can make men like Marcus disappear with a phone call, that you have people following him to make sure he leaves town, that you live like this and cook your mother's recipes like it's perfectly normal. But it doesn't?" She considered the question, really considered it. 3 months ago, the idea of being in the same room as someone connected to organized crime would have sent her running. But Marcus had taught her that danger came in many forms, that the most destructive threats often wore respectable faces and used familiar words. "No," she said finally. "It doesn't frighten me. What frightens me is going back to being someone who can be cornered in a grocery store by a man who thinks he owns me." Vincenzo moved the pan off the heat and turned to face her fully. Something had shifted in his expression, a careful assessment that made her feel like she was being evaluated for something important. "The people in my world, we have a code," he said. "We protect our own. We don't hurt innocents. We handle problems that the police can't or won't handle." "And Marcus is a problem?" "Marcus is a man who hurts women. In my world, that makes him a problem that needs to be solved permanently." There was something in his voice when he said it, a cold certainty that should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a fierce satisfaction that someone finally saw Marcus for what he really was. "What if I said I wanted to go home?" she asked. "Right now, tonight. What would you do?" "Drive you there myself. Make sure you got inside safely. Station someone outside your building to watch for trouble. But you'd let me go?" "Your choices are your own, Sophia. Always. The only thing I can control is whether you're protected while you make them." Something about the way he said her name, the respect in his voice when he talked about her choices, made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. When was the last time someone had offered to protect her without asking for anything in return? He approached her slowly, as if she might startle and run. When he was close enough to touch, he raised his hand to her face, his thumb brushing gently across her cheek. The gesture was so tender, so different from any touch she'd received in years, that she found herself leaning into his palm. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "For as long as you want to be." She looked up into his dark eyes and realized that somewhere between the restaurant and the grocery store, and this moment in his kitchen, she'd started to trust him completely. Not just with her physical safety, but with something much more fragile. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stay." Sophia woke to the smell of coffee and something that might have been fresh bread. For a moment she was completely disoriented, lying in a bed that was too comfortable and too large, surrounded by windows that showed a view she'd never seen before. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back. Marcus at the grocery store, Vincenzo's quiet intervention, the decision to stay in his penthouse rather than return to her vulnerable studio apartment. She'd slept in the guest bedroom, which was larger and more luxurious than any space she'd ever occupied. Egyptian cotton sheets, a mattress that must have cost more than her monthly rent, blackout curtains that had allowed her the first truly restful sleep she'd had in months. No wondering if every sound in the hallway was Marcus trying to get into her building. No checking the locks 3 times before bed. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 8:15, later than she'd slept in years. Her work schedule at the restaurant had trained her to wake before dawn, and even on her days off, anxiety usually had her up early. This was the first time since leaving California that she'd felt safe enough to actually rest. She found Vincenzo in the kitchen, already dressed for what she assumed was work, though his version of business attire probably cost more than she made in several months. Dark suit, crisp white shirt, shoes that gleamed with the kind of polish that suggested either expensive leather or obsessive care. But he'd rolled his sleeves up again, and there was something endearing about watching him navigate his own sophisticated kitchen. "Good morning," he said when he noticed her in the doorway. "I hope you slept well. Better than I have in months." She meant it, though admitting it made her feel oddly vulnerable. "Coffee?" he asked, already reaching for a second mug. "Please." She moved to help him, noting the way he'd laid out ingredients for what looked like an elaborate breakfast. "You don't have to cook for me. I can make something simple. I like to cook." It reminds me of her. There was something in his voice when he said it, a softness that made her heart contract with sympathy. She could picture him as a teenage boy, learning these recipes as a way to hold on to his mother's memory. "Tell me about her," Sophia said, accepting the coffee he offered. "What was she like?" Vincenzo's hands stilled on the eggs he was cracking into a bowl. "Beautiful. Fierce. She came from Sicily with nothing but the clothes on her back and built a life here through sheer determination. She would have liked you." "Why do you think that?" "Because she understood what it meant to start over. To build something new when everything you'd known was gone." Sophia felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She'd been so focused on survival for the past 3 months that she'd forgotten there might be people who would understand her choice to leave, who wouldn't judge her for running away. "What happened to her?" she asked gently. The official report said it was a car accident. Late at night, wet roads, tragic but unavoidable. But there were things about the scene that didn't make sense. Skid marks in the wrong place. Damage that suggested impact from behind. "You think someone killed her?" "I know someone killed her. She'd been getting threats because of my father's business, warnings that his family wasn't untouchable. 3 days later she was dead." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the 15-year-old boy underneath the sophisticated man. The child who'd lost his mother to violence and spent the next 17 years making sure it never happened again. "I'm so sorry," she said. "No one should have to grow up with that kind of loss. It taught me something important. The people we love are always vulnerable. The only way to protect them is to be more dangerous than anyone who might threaten them." She studied his profile as he returned to preparing breakfast, understanding now where his protective instincts came from. Not just cultural expectations or natural temperament, but hard-earned knowledge about how quickly safety could be destroyed. "Is that why you do what you do?" "Because of what happened to her." "Partly, but also because some problems can't be solved through legal channels. Men like Marcus, they know how to work the system. They're charming to police officers, convincing to judges, good at making their victims look unstable or vindictive." She knew exactly what he meant. Marcus had been a master at managing perception, presenting himself as the reasonable one while making her feel like she was overreacting to perfectly normal behavior. How do you explain to someone that controlling where you went and who you talked to felt suffocating when it was presented as caring? How do you make people understand that constant criticism disguised as helpful suggestions was actually designed to destroy your confidence? "He never hit me," she said suddenly, the words coming out before she'd consciously decided to share them. "I know that sounds like it should make it better, but somehow it made it worse. Because I couldn't point to bruises and say this is why I need help." Vincenzo's hands went completely still. When he looked at her, his eyes held a depth of understanding that made her chest tight. "What did he do?" "Everything else." The words came slowly, painfully, like removing splinters that had been embedded too long. "He controlled my money, made me account for every penny, convinced me to quit the job I loved because my coworkers were a bad influence, isolated me from friends by picking fights with them or making it so uncomfortable when they visited that they stopped coming around." Vincenzo's jaw was tight, but he remained silent, giving her space to continue. "He monitored my phone, my email, my social media. Said it was because he loved me and wanted to keep me safe. Made me feel guilty for wanting privacy, like secrecy was the same thing as betrayal. And the criticism was constant, but always wrapped up as helping me be better. The way I dressed, the way I talked, my career goals, my family relationships. Nothing was ever good enough, and somehow he made me believe it was my fault. She was crying now, not the dramatic sobs that Marcus had always dismissed as manipulation, but quiet tears that spoke to years of accumulated pain. By the time I realized what was happening, I didn't trust my own judgment about anything. I couldn't remember what I'd liked before I met him. Couldn't imagine making decisions without checking with him first. When I finally left, I had $400 in cash and no idea how to function as an independent person. Vincenzo set down the whisk he'd been holding and moved toward her slowly, giving her time to step away if she wanted. When she didn't retreat, he pulled her into his arms with a gentleness that made her cry harder. "You survived," he said quietly. "You got away from him and built a new life. That takes more courage than most people have." "I don't feel courageous. I feel damaged. Like I'll never be able to trust my own instincts again." "Your instincts are fine. You knew he was dangerous that first night at the restaurant. You knew to call me when he cornered you at the store. You recognized that staying with me was safer than going home alone." She pulled back to look at him, seeing something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. Not just sympathy or protection, but genuine admiration. "You see strength where I see weakness," she said. "I see a woman who refused to accept the limitations someone else tried to impose on her. That's not weakness, Sophia. That's the kind of strength most people never have to discover they possess." The way he said her name, the respect in his voice when he talked about her choices, made something shift in her chest. When was the last time someone had looked at her and seen capability instead of damage? She was suddenly hyper-aware of how close they were standing, the warmth radiating from his body, the way his hands felt protective and gentle on her back. When he reached up to brush a tear from her cheek, she found herself leaning into his touch. "You're incredible," he said quietly. "Do you know that?" She'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as desirable rather than burdensome. Marcus had trained her to think of herself as high maintenance, overly emotional, lucky to have found someone willing to put up with her flaws. But Vincenzo looked at her like she was something precious. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. She could see in his eyes that he wanted to kiss her, could feel her own body responding to his proximity with a warmth she'd thought Marcus had destroyed permanently. For the first time in 2 years, she wanted to be touched by someone. His phone rang. The sound cut through the intimacy like a blade, and Vincenzo stepped back with obvious reluctance. "Business," he said apologetically, glancing at the caller ID. "I have to take this." She watched him answer with that same calm authority she'd witnessed at the restaurant, his voice shifting into the professional tone that suggested important matters. But even as he spoke to whoever was on the other end, his eyes remained on her, warm and promising. When he hung up, his expression had changed. Not toward her, but in the way that suggested the outside world had intruded on their private moment. "I have to go out for a few hours," he said. "Business that can't wait. Will you be all right here?" Of course. Though the prospect of being alone in his penthouse felt strange, like playing house in someone else's life. "There are books in the library, movies on the system in the living room. Help yourself to anything you want." He was gathering his things, straightening his tie, transforming back into the dangerous man who could make problems disappear with a phone call. But when he approached her again, his touch was gentle as he cupped her face in his hands. "We're not finished with this conversation," he said quietly. Before she could respond, he leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. The gesture was chaste but somehow more intimate than passion, a promise that made her knees weak. She spent the morning exploring his space, trying to piece together who he was from the things he'd chosen to surround himself with. The books in his library were eclectic, classic literature mixed with history and philosophy, several volumes on business and strategy. The art on his walls was original, expensive pieces that showed sophisticated taste without being ostentatious. It was clear that money wasn't new to him, that he'd grown up with privilege even before whatever business success he'd achieved as an adult. But there were also personal touches that spoke to the man beneath the polished exterior. A framed photo of a beautiful woman who could only be his mother, fresh flowers that suggested he appreciated beauty in everyday things, a kitchen that was clearly used for actual cooking rather than just show. She was reading in the library when his phone rang on the coffee table where he'd left it charging. The caller ID showed a contact name that made her blood freeze. Marcus. She stared at the phone as it rang, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and fury. How had he gotten this number? What did he want? And more importantly, should she answer it? The ringing stopped, then immediately started again. This time she couldn't stand not knowing. Hello? She said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. There you are, baby. Marcus's voice was sickeningly sweet, the tone he'd used when he was about to deliver particularly devastating news wrapped in false concern. I've been trying to reach you. How did you get this number? I have my ways. Just like I have ways of reaching your sister. Her blood turned to ice. Lily? What does she have to do with anything? She's at UC Davis, right? Junior year, majoring in environmental science? Lives in that little apartment off campus with the blue door and the broken porch light? Stop, Sophia whispered. Leave her alone. I don't want to hurt her, Marcus continued conversationally. But you need to understand that your little disappearing act is affecting more than just you. Lily's been worried sick. Your parents are asking questions. Everyone wants to know where you are and why you won't return their calls. Because I changed my number and moved 3,000 miles away for a reason. The reason being that dramatic streak of yours. But you've made your point, baby. You got my attention. Now it's time to come home and work things out like adults. She could picture him as he spoke, probably sitting in his car outside Lily's apartment building, watching her 20-year-old sister walk to class completely unaware of the danger she was in. I'm not coming back, Marcus. Ever. And if you hurt my sister, you'll what? Call your new boyfriend? He laughed, the sound devoid of any real humor. Let me tell you something about men like that, Sophia. They're attracted to broken women because it makes them feel powerful. But once the novelty wears off, once they realize how much work you actually are, they disappear. Just like I should have done 2 years ago. Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice remained steady. He's not like you. No? Then why isn't he there to take this call? Why are you all alone in his fancy apartment while he's out handling business that's more important than you are? The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Even as she recognized the manipulation, the familiar pattern of finding her deepest insecurities and exploiting them, she felt the old doubts creeping in. You have 24 hours to come home, Marcus said, or I'm going to pay Lily a visit. Maybe help her understand what kind of person abandons their family without explanation. The line went dead. She sat staring at the phone for a long time, her mind racing through possibilities. She could call Lily and warn her, but that would mean explaining everything she'd been trying to spare her family from knowing. She could call the police, but what crime had Marcus actually committed? Making a phone call wasn't illegal, and his threats had been carefully worded to avoid anything that could be proven. When Vincenzo returned 3 hours later, he found her still in the library, holding his phone and staring at nothing. What happened? He asked immediately, his voice sharp with concern. She told him about the call, watching his expression grow darker with each detail. By the time she finished, the temperature in the room seemed to have dropped 10 degrees. He called here? On my private number? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Vincenzo was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his tone held that same cold certainty she'd heard in the grocery store. Marcus Chun will never threaten you or your family again, he said. I promise you that. What are you going to do? What should have been done 2 years ago? Something in his voice made her shiver, but not with fear. For the first time since Marcus had started controlling her life, someone was treating his threats as seriously as they deserved to be treated. I need to call my sister, she said. Warn her. Already done. She's being moved to a safe location until this is resolved. How did you? I have people in California. She's safe, Sophia. I give you my word. She looked at him standing there in his expensive suit, his dark eyes promising justice with a quiet intensity that should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, the absolute certainty that someone would fight for her. What if he doesn't back down? She asked. What if he tries to hurt her anyway? Then he'll discover that threatening my family was the last mistake he'll ever make. Your family? You're under my protection now. That makes you family. Something about the way he said it, the possessive warmth in his voice, made her chest tight with emotion. She found herself moving toward him without conscious decision, drawn by the promise of safety and something deeper. When she was close enough to touch, she reached up and cupped his face in her hands the way he'd done with her that morning. His skin was warm, slightly rough from whatever business had called him away, but his eyes softened as she traced her thumb along his cheekbone. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He covered her hands with his own, holding them against his face. "You don't have to thank me for this, Sophia. Protecting you isn't a favor. It's a privilege." She'd never heard anyone describe caring for her as a privilege before. Marcus had always made it clear that her needs were burdensome, that his attention was something she should be grateful to receive. But Vincenzo spoke like she was something worth fighting for. This time when he leaned down, she met him halfway. Their lips touched softly at first, a gentle exploration that tasted like possibility and promises. Then she deepened the kiss, pouring all of her gratitude and growing feelings into the contact between them. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. His forehead rested against hers, and she could see in his eyes the same amazement she was feeling. "I'm falling for you," she admitted quietly. "I know it's crazy and probably dangerous and definitely too fast, but I can't help it." "Not too fast," he said. "Not when it feels this right. Even knowing what you do, what your world involves. Especially because of that. You know exactly who I am, and you're choosing to stay anyway." She thought about that choice, really considered what it meant to align herself with someone who solved problems through methods that existed outside the law. 3 months ago, the idea would have horrified her. But Marcus had taught her that legal didn't always mean safe, that following the rules didn't protect you from people who were willing to break them. "I choose you," she said. "Whatever comes next, I choose you." The smile that spread across his face was unlike anything she'd seen from him before. Not the polite expression he wore in public or the carefully controlled mask he used for business, but something real and unguarded and beautiful. Then Marcus Chun just sealed his own fate. He said quietly. Sophia woke to the sound of Vincenzo's phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. They'd fallen asleep on the living room sofa after hours of talking, her head on his shoulder, his arms wrapped protectively around her. The previous evening had been perfect in its simplicity. Takeout from his favorite Italian place, wine that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and conversations that ranged from childhood memories to dreams for the future. For the first time since leaving California, she'd allowed herself to imagine what a real relationship might look like. Not the careful dance of trying to avoid triggering someone's anger, but actual partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The phone continued buzzing. Vincenzo stirred beneath her, his hand automatically moving to stroke her hair before he seemed to register the intrusion. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "I should take this." She shifted so he could reach the phone, noting the way his expression changed as he read the caller ID. All softness disappeared, replaced by the cold focus she'd learned to associate with his business dealings. "Marco," he said, answering on the fourth ring. "What is it?" She couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she could see the way Vincenzo's jaw tightened as he listened. His free hand found hers, squeezing gently, but his attention was completely focused on whatever news was being delivered. "When?" he asked sharply. "How long ago?" More listening, then a stream of rapid Italian that she didn't understand but recognized as instructions. Command decisions being made with the kind of authority that came from years of handling crises. "Keep watching the building. Don't move until I get there. And Marco? If anyone else goes in or out, I want to know immediately." He hung up and was already moving toward his bedroom, pulling her with him. Something had shifted in his demeanor. The protective man she'd been falling in love with transforming into someone harder and more dangerous. "What happened?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would involve Marcus. "He has your sister." The words hit her like a physical blow. She sank onto the edge of his bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Lily. Sweet, trusting Lily who'd never hurt anyone in her life and whose biggest worry should have been midterm exams. "How?" she whispered. "You said your people were watching her." He grabbed her while she was walking to her car after class. Broad daylight, campus parking lot, grabbed her and drove off before anyone could react. She could picture it perfectly. Lily fumbling for her keys, probably thinking about whatever assignment was due next week, completely unprepared for the kind of violence that had shaped Sophia's world for the past 2 years. He called from her phone 10 minutes ago. Wants to meet you at the warehouse district in South Boston. Midnight. Come alone, or he hurts her. The rational part of her mind recognized this as exactly the kind of trap that Marcus would set. But the sister in her, the woman who'd helped raise Lily after their parents' divorce, couldn't think past the image of her baby sister scared and alone with a man capable of anything. I have to go, she said. No, absolutely not. Vincenzo was moving through his closet with military precision, selecting clothes that were darker and more practical than his usual business attire. She watched him arm himself with weapons she hadn't known he possessed, the transformation from sophisticated businessman to something far more dangerous happening before her eyes. She's my sister. I won't let her get hurt because of me. She won't get hurt. But you're not walking into an obvious trap to ensure it. Then what do you suggest? Because he was very clear about what happens if I don't show up. Vincenzo finished dressing and turned to face her, his dark eyes holding a kind of cold calculation that should have frightened her. Instead, she felt a fierce satisfaction that Marcus had finally pushed someone who could push back harder. We're going to end this. Tonight. Permanently. The way he said it left no doubt about what permanently meant. Marcus had made the mistake of threatening not just her, but someone under Vincenzo's protection. In his world, that was the kind of error that had fatal consequences. I want to come with you. Absolutely not. She stood up, moving close enough to see her reflection in his dark eyes. This started with me. I want to be there when it ends. Too dangerous. More dangerous than letting him think he can take my family whenever he wants leverage over me. More dangerous than spending the rest of my life wondering if he'll come back. Vincenzo studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him weighing her words against his protective instincts. Finally, he nodded slowly. You stay in the car with Marco. You don't get out, you don't interfere, and if something goes wrong, you drive away and don't look back. Agreed. The warehouse district at 11:45 looked exactly like what it was, the perfect place for bad things to happen without witnesses. Industrial buildings squatted in the darkness, their broken windows staring blindly at empty streets where the only light came from widely spaced street lamps. Sophia sat in the passenger seat of Marco's car, watching Vincenzo's men position themselves with the kind of professional efficiency that spoke to extensive experience with situations like this. They moved through the shadows like smoke, disappearing into positions that would give them clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. Vincenzo appeared at her window, his face grim but determined. His usual expensive suit had been replaced by dark clothing that wouldn't show blood, and she could see the outline of weapons concealed beneath his jacket. Remember what we agreed, he said. No matter what happens, you stay here. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Now that the moment was here, she felt sick with worry for both of them. Lily, trapped somewhere with Marcus and his desperate fury. Vincenzo, walking into a confrontation that could end with him dead or imprisoned. He started to turn away, then came back to cup her face in his hands. I love you, he said quietly. I should have told you before, but I wanted to wait until this was over. Until you were safe. The words hit her harder than any of Marcus's threats ever had. She'd known she was falling for him, had felt the connection growing stronger every day, but hearing him say it out loud made everything real in a way that terrified and thrilled her simultaneously. I love you too, she whispered. Please be careful. Always am. He kissed her then, soft and desperate, and full of promises about a future they'd build together once Marcus was no longer a threat. When he pulled away, his eyes held the kind of fierce determination that made her believe he could accomplish anything. She watched him walk toward the designated warehouse, his movements confident despite the obvious danger. This was his world, she reminded herself. He knew how to navigate situations like this, had been doing it successfully for years. But knowing that didn't stop her heart from racing or her hands from shaking as she waited in the darkness. The warehouse Marcus had chosen was perfect for an ambush. Multiple entrances, numerous places to hide, and enough distance from the main road that gunshots wouldn't attract immediate attention. If she'd been planning to hurt someone, she would have chosen something very similar. But Vincenzo had been planning ambushes longer than Marcus had been planning anything. Through her earpiece, she could hear the quiet communication between Vincenzo and his men. Positions confirmed, escape routes secured, backup plans activated. They'd turn Marcus's trap into their own hunting ground. Target approaching, came Marco's voice through the radio. 2 vehicles, at least 6 men visible. More than they'd expected, but not enough to change the fundamental equation. Marcus was a bully who'd escalated to kidnapping. Vincenzo was a professional who'd built his life around handling problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. She saw Marcus before she heard his voice. He emerged from the lead car with the kind of swagger that suggested he thought he held all the cards, dragging Lily behind him with one hand wrapped around her arm. Even from a distance, she could see that her sister was terrified but unharmed. "Sophia, baby," Marcus called out, his voice echoing off the empty buildings. "I know you're here somewhere. Time to come home." Vincenzo stepped out of the shadows with the kind of calm presence that made everyone else seem like amateurs. He moved without hurry, without obvious weapons, but somehow managed to command the entire space simply by existing within it. "Let the girl go, Chun. This is between you and me now." Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and ugly in the industrial silence. "You think you're in charge here? I've got 6 men and a hostage. What do you have?" "The moral high ground," Vincenzo replied. "And better planning." That was when Marcus's backup began disappearing. It happened quickly and quietly, professional work that spoke to years of experience. One moment there were 6 men positioning themselves around the warehouse. The next there were 3, then 2. Then just Marcus standing alone with Lily while his remaining men looked around in growing panic. "What the hell?" Marcus demanded, his confidence finally beginning to crack. "You made a mistake, Chun. You threatened someone I care about. In my world, that has consequences." Sophia could see the moment Marcus realized he'd miscalculated catastrophically. His grip on Lily tightened, and even from the car she could see her sister wince in pain. "I'll hurt her," Marcus said desperately. "I swear I'll hurt her if you don't back off." "No," Vincenzo said quietly. "You won't." The shot came from somewhere in the darkness, precisely placed to shatter Marcus's wrist without hitting Lily. He screamed and released her, dropping to his knees as blood poured from the wound. Lily ran toward Vincenzo without hesitation, her instincts correctly identifying him as safety rather than threat. He caught her gently, speaking to her in the same soothing tone he'd used with Sophia that first night at the restaurant. Marcus was still screaming, clutching his ruined hand, and calling for backup that was never going to come. His men were either unconscious or had decided that whatever he was paying them wasn't worth dying for. "It's over," Vincenzo said, approaching the injured man with the kind of cold purpose that made Sophia's blood run cold. "You're going to disappear from their lives completely. If you ever contact Sophia or her family again, if you even think about them, I'll make sure you disappear permanently." "You can't do this," Marcus gasped. "You can't just, I can do whatever I want, Chun. That's the difference between us. You hurt people because you're weak. I hurt people because sometimes it's necessary." Sirens were approaching in the distance, called by someone who'd reported gunshots. But Marcus wouldn't be around to talk to the police. By the time the authorities arrived, they'd find evidence of a kidnapping that had been interrupted by unknown parties, and Marcus Chun would be on his way to a very long conversation with people who specialized in making problems disappear. Sophia was out of the car and running before Marco could stop her. She reached Lily just as the police sirens grew loud enough to hurt her ears, pulling her sister into a fierce hug that conveyed years of love and protection. "You're safe," she whispered. "You're safe now." Over Lily's head, she met Vincenzo's eyes and saw in them the promise that this nightmare was finally over. Marcus was being loaded into a car that would take him somewhere far away from their lives, his threats permanently silenced by the kind of justice that didn't require courtrooms or legal proceedings. "Is it finished?" she asked. Vincenzo nodded, his expression already shifting back to the gentleman she'd fallen in love with. "Completely finished. He'll never hurt anyone again." She believed him. More than that, she trusted the cold certainty in his voice that said Marcus Chun had made his last mistake when he'd decided to threaten Vincenzo's family. As they walked away from the warehouse district, Lily safe between them and the sirens fading into the distance behind them, Sophia realized she wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in 2 years, she could imagine a future that didn't include looking over her shoulder or checking locks 3 times before bed. She was free, and she was in love with the man who'd made that freedom possible. The safe house where they took Lily was nothing like the warehouse district. Clean, comfortable, staffed by people who treated her sister with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested they were used to protecting innocent bystanders who'd been caught in dangerous situations. Sophia sat with Lily in a small but well-appointed living room, holding her sister's hands and trying to process the events of the past few hours. Marcus was gone, permanently this time, but the way he'd been removed from their lives had forced her to confront the reality of what Vincenzo's world actually involved. He'd killed people tonight. Maybe not directly, but he'd given orders that resulted in violence and death. The man she loved was capable of orchestrating the kind of justice that existed outside any legal system, and she had to decide if she could live with that knowledge. "Are you okay?" Lily asked, studying her face with the perceptive concern that had always made her wise beyond her years. "Really okay, I mean. Not just physically." Sophia considered the question carefully. Was she okay with loving someone who solved problems through methods that most people would find morally questionable? Was she okay with building a life in a world where conflicts were resolved through force rather than negotiation? The answer surprised her with its clarity. "Yes," she said. "I'm okay." Because 3 months ago, she'd been trapped in a relationship with someone who used psychological manipulation and emotional abuse to control her behavior. The legal system had offered her no protection from Marcus's methods, no recourse when he'd isolated her from friends and family, no help when he'd convinced everyone around them that she was the problem. But Vincenzo's world had rules too. Different rules, administered through different methods, but with a moral code that protected the innocent and punished those who preyed on the vulnerable. Marcus had spent 2 years hurting her with impunity. Tonight, he'd face consequences for those choices. "I need to tell you something," Sophia said to her sister. "About why I really left California, about Marcus, about everything I should have told you months ago." She explained it all. The gradual erosion of her independence, the constant criticism disguised as caring, the way Marcus had made her feel like she was losing her mind. Lily listened without judgment, her expression growing more horrified as the story unfolded. "Why didn't you tell us?" Lily asked when she finished. "We would have helped you. Because he was so good at making me feel like I was overreacting, like I was being dramatic or ungrateful or impossible to please. And because I was ashamed that I'd let it happen." "You didn't let anything happen. He manipulated you. That's not your fault." The conversation continued for another hour. Years of carefully hidden pain finally brought into the light. By the time Vincenzo returned, both sisters were exhausted but closer than they'd been since childhood. He approached them carefully, his usual confidence tempered by awareness that he was intruding on a private moment. His expensive clothes were gone, replaced by dark jeans and a simple sweater that made him look younger and more approachable. "How are you feeling?" he asked Lily, his voice gentle. "Better. Thank you for getting me away from him. Sophia told me what you did, what you risked to keep us safe. You're her family, which makes you my family. Protecting you wasn't a risk, it was a responsibility." Sophia felt her chest tighten with emotion at the casual way he claimed them both. Family wasn't just a word to him. It was a commitment that came with absolute obligations. "A car will take you back to school tomorrow," Vincenzo continued. "There will be security watching your building for the next few weeks, just as a precaution. You won't see them, but they'll be there." "What about Marcus?" Lily asked. "Will he come back?" "No," Vincenzo said with quiet certainty. "He won't be coming back." Something in his tone suggested that the question of Marcus's return had been settled permanently, in ways that didn't bear detailed discussion. Lily seemed to understand this, nodding without asking for elaboration. Later, after Lily had been settled in one of the guest rooms and arrangements had been made for her safe return to California, Sophia found herself alone with Vincenzo in his penthouse. The familiar space felt different now, charged with the knowledge of what they'd been through together and what it meant for their future. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "About us, about this world, about what happened tonight." She considered the question seriously, turning over her feelings like stones in her hand. The violence should have horrified her. The casual way his men had eliminated threats should have sent her running. The knowledge that she was in love with someone who operated outside legal boundaries should have terrified her. Instead, she felt safer than she had in years. "No second thoughts," she said, "but I need to understand something. Tonight, what you did to Marcus and his men, is that what your life is like? Is that what our life would be like?" Vincenzo moved to the window, looking out at the city lights below. "Most of what I do is business." legitimate business, restaurants, construction, import and export. The other part, the part you saw tonight, that only happens when someone threatens what matters to me. And I matter to you? He turned to face her, his dark eyes holding an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You matter to me more than anything else in this world. More than the business, more than the family reputation, more than my own safety. The conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. She could see in his expression that he meant every word, that she'd somehow become the center of his carefully ordered universe. I want to build a life with you, Sophia. A real life. Not just protection from your past, but a future we create together. But I need to know if you can accept all of who I am. She moved toward him slowly, thinking about everything she'd learned about love and protection and what it meant to be truly safe. Marcus had used the language of care to justify control. But Vincenzo had put his life on the line to give her choices. I love you, she said. All of you. The man who cooks his mother's recipes and reads philosophy books and makes me feel like I'm worth protecting. And yes, even the man who can make problems disappear when someone threatens his family. His relief was visible, tension leaving his shoulders as if a weight had been lifted. You're sure? I'm sure. But I have one condition. Anything. I want to meet your family. Really meet them. Not just as someone you're protecting, but as someone you're planning a future with. The smile that spread across his face was radiant. I was hoping you'd say that. 2 weeks later, Sophia found herself in a restaurant in the North End, surrounded by more Romanos than she'd known existed. Aunts and uncles and cousins, all gathering to meet the woman who'd captured their nephew's heart. She'd expected to feel intimidated, out of place among people who moved through the world with such casual confidence. Instead, she felt welcomed, embraced, accepted into a family that took loyalty seriously and protected their own fiercely. Vincenzo's Aunt Maria, a formidable woman in her 70s, took her aside during dessert. You make him happy, she said simply. We haven't seen him smile like this since his mother died. The approval meant more than any formal blessing could have. These people had known Vincenzo his entire life, had watched him build himself into someone worthy of respect and fear in equal measure. If they thought she was good for him, then maybe she truly belonged in his world. It was during the drive home that Vincenzo pulled into a quiet overlook with a view of the harbor. The city spread out below them, lights reflecting on the dark water like fallen stars. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. The ring box was small and elegant, holding a piece of jewelry that was clearly antique and obviously precious. The diamond was set in platinum filigree that spoke of old-world craftsmanship and family history. This was my grandmother's ring, Vincenzo said. My mother's before that. It's been waiting for the right woman for 17 years. Sophia stared at the ring, understanding the significance of what he was offering. Not just marriage, but integration into a legacy that stretched back generations. Sophia-chan, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my family? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with everything they'd been through and everything they wanted to build together. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 months ago, afraid and broken and convinced she'd never trust anyone again. Then she looked at the man who'd seen her strength when she couldn't see it herself. Yes, she whispered. Yes to everything. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her finger specifically. When Vincenzo kissed her, she could taste the future in his lips. Sunday dinners with his family, lazy mornings in their shared bed, children who would grow up knowing they were loved and protected absolutely. 6 months later, Sophia Romano stood in the kitchen of her own restaurant, watching the dinner service with the kind of satisfied exhaustion that came from building something meaningful. Bella Vita wasn't Bellinate, but it was hers in a way the other place had never been. Her menu, her staff, her vision brought to life through Vincenzo's support and her own determination. The wedding had been everything she dreamed of and nothing like what Marcus would have demanded. Small and intimate, focused on family and love rather than appearances. She'd worn her grandmother-in-law's dress, altered to fit, but carrying the blessing of the Romano women who'd worn it before her. Her sister had been her maid of honor, recovered completely from her ordeal and stronger for having seen what real protection looked like. Their parents had flown in from California, surprised but pleased to see their daughter so obviously happy and cherished. If you've ever wondered what the difference is between someone who protects you and someone who controls you, Sophia thought as she watched Vincenzo talking to one of their regular customers, it's this. Protection gives you wings, while control clips them. A man who truly loves you doesn't make himself essential by making you weak. He becomes essential by making you strong enough to choose him freely every single day. The evening rush was winding down when she felt familiar arms wrap around her waist from behind. Even 6 months of marriage hadn't diminished the thrill she felt when Vincenzo touched her, the safety and desire that came with his proximity. "How was your day, Mrs. Romano?" he asked, pressing a kiss to the side of her neck. "Perfect," she said, leaning back against his chest. "Busy but perfect." "I have news," he said, and something in his tone made her turn in his arms. "Good news?" "The best. Marcus Chun was sentenced today. 25 years for kidnapping, stalking, and violating a restraining order. He'll be an old man before he gets out, and when he does, there will be people watching to make sure he doesn't bother anyone else." She felt the last knot of tension she'd been carrying dissolve completely. It was truly over. Marcus was gone from her life permanently, not through violence, but through the legal system finally working as it was supposed to. "There's something else," Vincenzo continued, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "Something I think you should know." She looked down at his hand and felt her heart skip. They'd been trying for a baby, talking about the children they wanted to raise in a world where love and protection went hand in hand. "Are you telling me what I think you're telling me?" she asked. "Dr. Martinez called this afternoon. Congratulations, cara mia. We're going to be parents." The joy that flooded through her was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Complete and overwhelming and perfect. This was what happiness felt like, she realized. Not the desperate gratitude she'd felt when Marcus occasionally treated her well, but the steady certainty that came from being loved without conditions. As she kissed her husband in their restaurant, surrounded by the life they'd built together, Sophia thought about the terrified woman who'd frozen in the middle of Bella Notte 6 months ago. That woman could never have imagined this future, married to a man who saw her as an equal partner, running her own business, carrying a child who would grow up knowing that love was supposed to feel safe. Sometimes the best protection comes from the most unexpected places, she thought. And sometimes the most dangerous-looking person is actually the safest choice you'll ever make.